Have you ever seen a plane with no engine? Imagine a huge wooden box with wings. It's filled with soldiers and equipment. A bigger plane tows it high into the sky, then lets it go. It silently glides down toward a field in enemy territory. The landing is a controlled crash. That was a combat glider. Thousands of them were used during the Second World War. They were a one-way ticket into the fight. Why would anyone sign up for that? How did they even work? And what did it look like when they came back to Earth? Number 20, were they really just plywood coffins? Like, look at this first photograph. It's a close-up of a wrecked glider. The nose is smashed into a ditch. The canvas skin is ripped wide open. You can see the skeleton of the aircraft. It's a simple frame of steel tubes. The floor is plywood, there's nothing else. No armor, no engine, no parachutes for the men inside, just a thin layer of fabric separating them from the outside world. It looks unbelievably fragile. It's easy to see why the soldiers who flew in them had dark nicknames for them. American troops called the Waco CG-4A the Flying Coffin, or the Tau Target. The primary American glider was the Waco CG-4A. It was designed by the Weaver Aircraft Company of Ohio. Over 13,900 were built by 16 different contractors, including furniture makers and piano companies. This was because the glider's construction was relatively simple. It used materials that weren't critical for building bombers or fighters. The frame was welded steel tubing. The wings were made of wood. Everything was covered in treated fabric. The design was meant to be cheap and disposable. It was a single-use vehicle. The British had their own main glider, the Airspeed Horsa. It was much larger than the Waco. It was made almost entirely of wood, using a stressed skin plywood construction. It could carry nearly twice as many troops, or it could fit a jeep and a trailer. But it was still just wood. And a study conducted by the Royal Aircraft Establishment after the war, titled An Inquiry into Glider Landing Accidents, noted that the wooden fuselage of the Horsa often splintered violently on impact. This created thousands of sharp wooden daggers that could impale the occupants. The report is a dry, technical document, but its findings are grim. It details the structural failures observed in countless crash sites. So you have these two main designs. One is a fabric-covered steel frame. The other is a big plywood box. Neither offered any real protection. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't climb or escape if things went wrong. They were completely at the mercy of the tow plane pilot, the glider pilot, and the conditions on the ground. This photo of the wrecked frame shows the reality. It wasn't a sophisticated war machine. It was a basic, expendable delivery crate for soldiers. And how many men looked at the flimsy construction before their first mission and realized their chances were much lower than they had been told? Number 19 who dared to fly these things. This next image is different. It's not a crash. It's a group of young men. They are standing in front of a glider on a training field in Texas or North Carolina. They are smiling, but there's a certain look in their eyes. They are the glider pilots. They were a unique breed. They weren't quite pilots in the traditional sense. They were more like specialists in a very specific, very dangerous skill, the dead stick landing. They had to land a heavy, overloaded, and unpowered aircraft in an unprepared field, often at night, often under fire. Becoming a glider pilot was a strange process. In the American military, the program started from scratch in 1941. At first, they recruited experienced civilian pilots, but the demand was huge. Soon, the Army Air Forces created the Glider Pilot Training Program. They took volunteers from all branches of the Army. Some were infantrymen who wanted to fly. Others were trainee power pilots who had washed out of the regular flight school. The training was fast and intense. They learned to fly light aircraft first, like the Piper Cub. Then they moved on to training gliders. Finally, they graduated to the big combat gliders. The motto of the U.S. glider pilots was Nihil sine labor et periculo, which means nothing without toil and danger. It was fitting. Their job was arguably one of the most hazardous of the war. They had none of the glamour of fighter pilots. They flew a one-way mission and then were expected to pick up a rifle and fight as infantrymen alongside the troops they had just delivered. As First Lieutenant Recruz of the 439th Troop Carrier Group stated in a post-mission debrief documented in the group's official history, the landing is the end of our job as pilots and the beginning of our job as soldiers. The British training program, centered at places like RAF Brize Norton, was similarly rigorous. They often recruited from Army volunteers, creating a force of pilots who were soldiers first. Men from regiments, like the Glider Pilot Regiment, had a dual identity. They were trained to fly the Horsa glider and then lead the men they carried into battle. This dual role created an incredible bond between the pilots and their passengers. The pilots weren't just dropping off supplies. They were leading the charge. So when you look at this photo of these smiling young men, you're not just seeing pilots. You're seeing a hybrid soldier, a man trained to perform one of the most difficult feats of aviation, and then immediately transition to ground combat. They were a small and often overlooked group, but their role was critical, and yet there are things we will never know. What was the true psychological toll of knowing every flight was a one-way trip? How did they manage the fear in those silent minutes after being released from the tow plane? And what private conversations did they have among themselves, away from the official reports, about their real chances of survival? Number 18, how do you steer a brick with wings? Here is a photo taken from inside the cockpit of a Waco glider. It's cramped. The controls are deceptively simple. A control wheel for the ailerons and elevator, pedals for the rudder, a few basic instruments, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and a simple turn and bank indicator. The most important instrument is a piece of string taped to the front windscreen. It was a yaw string, a primitive tool to show if the glider was flying straight. In front of the two pilots, a huge plexiglass nose gives a panoramic and completely vulnerable view of the world outside. Flying a combat glider was nothing like flying a normal airplane. It had terrible aerodynamics. Pilots said the Waco flew like a brick. The Horsa was a bit better, but it was still a huge, lumbering aircraft with no power to correct a mistake. The key was managing energy. Once the tow rope was released, the glider was living on borrowed time. Every foot of altitude was potential energy that could be converted into distance. The pilot had to make a constant trade-off between speed and distance to reach the landing zone. The landing was the most critical part. There were no go-arounds. You only got one shot. Pilots were trained to use a technique called A-stall landing. They would fly the glider just above the ground at a speed barely above its stall speed. Then, at the last possible moment, they would pull back on the controls, causing the wings to lose lift. The glider would drop the last few feet to the ground with a heavy thud. This technique allowed them to stop in a very short distance, which was essential for the small, obstacle-filled fields they were aiming for. In his book, Silent Wings at War, author John L. Loden includes interviews with dozens of pilots. A common theme emerges. They describe the intense concentration required. They had to watch their airspeed like a hawk. Too slow and they would stall and crash. Too fast and they would overshoot the field and smash into whatever lay beyond it. They had to read the wind, spot obstacles in the dark, and maneuver a 7,500-pound aircraft for a Waco with the delicacy of a surgeon. All of this while people might be shooting at them. The control forces were heavy. There were no hydraulic assists. Flying the glider was physically demanding. The pilot was wrestling with the aircraft the whole way down. This photo of the cockpit, with its simple, almost crude layout, hides the immense skill and physical effort it took to get the machine on the ground in one piece. There are details about the flying experience we can't fully grasp. How did the lack of engine noise affect a pilot's perception of speed and descent? Did that yaw string, that simple piece of yarn, really save lives by preventing deadly stalls in the final moments of approach? And how many pilots in those last seconds made a conscious choice to crash into one obstacle over another to save the men in the back? Number 17, what did it feel like to be towed? This photograph is breathtaking. It's taken from a tow plane. Looking back, a long, thin nylon rope stretches out behind the C-47 Dakota. At the other end, seemingly tiny, is a Waco glider. It's suspended in the sky, a silent passenger being pulled through the air. The image captures the strange and precarious relationship between the two aircraft. The glider is completely dependent on the tow plane for its entire journey, until the final, critical moments. The process of getting airborne was called the snatch. The tow plane would fly low over the airfield, trailing a hook. The glider's tow rope would be laid out on the ground, attached to the glider at one end, and looped over two posts at the other. The towplane's hook would catch the loop, and the glider would be violently yanked into the air. It went from a standstill to over 100 miles per hour in a matter of seconds. The acceleration was brutal for everyone inside. Once in the air, the flight was a constant struggle. The glider pilot had to fly formation on the towplane. They couldn't just sit back and relax. They had to actively fly the glider to keep it in the correct position. The ideal spot was slightly above the wake turbulence of the towplane. If they flew too low, they would get, caught in the rough air. If they flew too high, they could pull the tail of the towplane up, creating a dangerous situation for both aircraft. There was a simple telephone line embedded in the tow rope for communication, but it often failed. Pilots relied on signal lamps or rocking their wings to communicate. The tow ropes themselves were a piece of advanced technology for the time. They were typically made of nylon, about 350 feet long and an inch in diameter. They had to be incredibly strong to handle the snatch takeoff and the strain of towing, but also have a degree of elasticity to absorb shocks. Yet, they were a major point of failure. Ropes snapped. The release mechanisms, both in the tow plane and the glider, sometimes jammed. A glider pilot whose rope snapped over the ocean had no options. The journey could last for hours. The men inside the glider were cramped, often airsick, and filled with a growing sense of dread. They were helpless passengers on a ride they couldn't control. The book, The Glider Gang, by Milton Denk, a glider pilot himself, describes these long flights in detail. He writes about the boredom mixed with terror, the constant drone of the towplane's engines, and the sudden, shocking silence when the rope was finally released. That silence was the signal that their part of the mission was about to begin. Some questions about this phase of the flight remain unanswered. How many near misses occurred between gliders in large formations that were never officially reported? What was the failure rate of the tow ropes, and was this information kept from the pilots to maintain morale? And what was the conversation like in the cockpit of the tow plane when they released a glider, knowing they were sending those men into a situation they themselves would fly away from? Number 16, what was the first great glider attack? This is a grainy reconnaissance photo. It shows a large star-shaped fortress. On the grassy areas on top of the fort, there are several small, dark shapes. They look like discarded toys. They are the DFS 230 gliders used by German forces to capture the Belgian fort of Eben Emael on May 10th, 1940. This event was the world's introduction to the potential of combat gliders. It was a complete shock to the Allied powers. The fort was considered impregnable. It commanded the key bridges over the Albert Canal. Its guns could stop any ground advance. But it had a fatal flaw. Its defenses were pointed outward. The roof was a large, flat, open area, thought to be safe from attack. German planners realized that a small elite force delivered silently and directly onto the roof could neutralize the fort's gun casemates. An airplane couldn't land there. Paratroopers would be too scattered and vulnerable, but gliders were perfect. A special unit of engineers was trained for months in complete secrecy. They practiced landing the DFS 230 gliders on mock-ups of the fort's roof. The DFS 230 was a small glider carrying only 9 soldiers. It was light and could land in a very short space. On the morning of the attack, 11 gliders were towed into the air. 9 of them made it to the target. They were released miles away and glided silently toward the fort, arriving just after dawn. The Belgian defenders were taken completely by surprise. The commandos used a new weapon, hollow charges. These were powerful explosives capable of blasting through the thick steel and concrete of the gun emplacements. Within minutes of landing, they had systematically destroyed the fort's primary weapons. The garrison of over 1,000 men was trapped inside, unable to fight back effectively. The next day, ground forces linked up with the glider troops and the fort surrendered. The strategic bridges were captured intact. It was a stunning success, achieved by fewer than 80 men. The attack on Eben Emael was studied intensely by military planners around the world. It showed that gliders were not just a novelty, they were a tool for achieving complete tactical surprise. The silence of their approach was their greatest weapon. This event directly spurred the development of the American and British glider programs. Military leaders like General George C. Marshall and Winston Churchill saw the potential and ordered the creation of their own airborne forces. The lessons learned from this single, daring raid would shape the airborne operations for the rest of the war. But mysteries remain. How did the German planners so accurately predict the psychological effect of the silent attack on the fort's defenders? Were there any Belgian intelligence reports about the German glider training that were dismissed as impossible? And if those 9 gliders had been detected just a few minutes earlier, would the entire course of the invasion of France and the Low Countries have been different? Number 15, could a glider really carry a tank? The photo here is almost comical if it weren't so serious. A massive glider, the General Aircraft Hamilcar, is on an airfield. Its entire nose section is swung open to the side like a giant door. A small tank, a Tetrarch light tank, is driving down a ramp out of the glider's cavernous hold. This image answers the question directly. Yes, a glider could carry a tank, but it was an incredible feat of engineering. The Hamilcar was the largest and heaviest glider used by the Allies. It was a monster. With a wingspan of 110 feet, it was bigger than a Lancaster bomber. It was designed specifically to carry heavy equipment that couldn't be dropped by parachute. Its primary load was the Tetrarch or the American M22 Locust light tank. It could also carry 2 Bren gun carriers or a variety of artillery pieces and vehicles. The design was a marvel of utility. The cockpit was placed high on top of the fuselage, giving the pilots a good view but also making them incredibly exposed. The main body was essentially a huge, empty wooden box. The nose hinge was the key innovation. It allowed vehicles to be loaded and unloaded quickly. The tank crew would travel inside their vehicle during the flight. Once the glider landed, they would start the engine, the nose would be opened, and they could drive straight into the battle. In theory, it was a brilliant way to deliver armored support to airborne troops. The reality was, as always, more complicated. The Hamilcar was difficult to fly. It was so heavy that it required a 4-engine bomber like a Halifax or a Sterling to tow it. The landings were extremely hazardous. A 36,000-pound wooden aircraft landing in a rough field was a recipe for disaster. Many Hamilcars were destroyed on landing during operations like D-Day and the Rhine crossing. The tanks they carried sometimes broke loose from their moorings during a rough landing, crushing the pilots in the cockpit above them. The Hamilcar was first used on D-Day, June 6, 1944. A small number of them landed near the Orne River to support the British 6th Airborne Division. The tanks they brought, while light, provided crucial firepower in the first hours of the invasion. According to the operational records of the Glider Pilot Regiment, several tanks were successfully deployed and engaged enemy positions almost immediately after landing. Despite the high risks and losses, the concept was proven to work. But there are questions that linger. Was the survival rate for the Hamilcar pilots compared to those flying the smaller Horsa or Waco? How did the tank crews cope with the psychological stress of being trapped inside their vehicle, inside a wooden glider, with no way to escape? And were there ever plans for even larger gliders capable of carrying even heavier tanks that were ultimately deemed too dangerous to pursue? Number 14, what was the Allies' first big mistake? This image is grim. It shows the splintered wreckage of a Waco glider washed up on a rocky shoreline. The sea is in the background. This isn't a training accident. This is the result of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. It was the first large-scale use of gliders by the American and British forces, and it was a catastrophe. The plan was ambitious. British and American airborne troops were to land by glider and parachute ahead of the main seaborne invasion force. They were to seize key bridges and road junctions to prevent the enemy from reinforcing the beaches. On paper, it looked like a classic airborne operation inspired by the German successes. In practice, almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The problem started with the towplane pilots. Many of them were inexperienced in long-range overwater navigation, especially at night. They were flying in a massive, complex formation. The weather was also a major factor. High winds, stronger than forecasted, buffeted the aircraft. This made formation flying nearly impossible and threw the navigators off course. As the formations approached the coast of Sicily, they were met with heavy anti-aircraft fire from both the enemy and, tragically, from their own naval fleet. The nervous gunners on the Allied ships had not been properly briefed and fired on anything they saw in the sky. The result was chaos. Many towplane pilots, lost and under fire, released their gliders too early. Of the 144 gliders that took off for the British operation, 69 were released over the sea. They plunged into the Mediterranean. Over 250 men drowned. The American operation fared little better. Out of 137 gliders, only 12 landed near their objective. Many others landed scattered across miles of southern Sicily or also in the sea. The official report on the airborne phase of the operation, later declassified, is a litany of errors in planning, training, and execution. The photograph of the wrecked glider on the beach is a powerful symbol of this failure. The men inside that glider survived the flight, survived the release, and survived the ditching in the water, only to be thrown against the rocks by the waves. The lessons learned from Sicily were paid for in blood. The disaster led to a major overhaul of airborne doctrine. It stressed the need for better pilot training, improved navigation equipment, and most importantly, better coordination between the air, sea, and ground forces. Still, we have to ask some hard questions. How much of the failure was due to inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy? Were the reports from meteorologists about the high winds deliberately downplayed by commanders eager to launch the invasion on schedule? And for the men who drowned in the dark, trapped inside their sinking gliders, was there any official inquiry into who was truly responsible for releasing them so far from shore? Number 13. How did gliders capture a single bridge? Here we see a photo of 3 Horsa gliders. They are sitting almost perfectly intact in a tight cluster next to a bridge over a canal. One of them has its nose buried right at the edge of the bridge's gun emplacement. This is Pegasus Bridge in Normandy. The capture of this bridge in the opening minutes of D-Day, June 6, 1944, is perhaps the most famous and successful glider operation in history. It was a mission that required unbelievable precision. The plan, codenamed Operation Deadstick, was a coup-de-mine assault. A small force from the British 6th Airborne Division, led by Major John Howard, was to land in 6 gliders. 3 were to land at the bridge over the Caen Canal, later renamed Pegasus Bridge, and 3 at the nearby bridge over the River Orne. They had to land in the dark within a few dozen yards of their objectives and capture the bridges before the defenders could blow them up. The success of the mission depended entirely on the skill of the glider pilots. They were the best of the best in the glider pilot regiment. They trained for months studying maps, aerial photographs, and detailed models of the landing zones. The lead glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, had Major Howard and his platoon on board. They were released from their Halifax bomber tow plane at about 5,000 feet, several miles from the target. What followed was a masterclass in flying. Walwork navigated in the dark, using landmarks and dead reckoning. He put the Horsa into a steep dive to lose altitude quickly and ensure he didn't overshoot the tiny landing zone. The landing was rough. The glider hit the ground at over 90 miles per hour and screeched to a halt, its nose smashing through the first line of barbed wire, just as planned. The impact knocked both pilots unconscious, but the troops in the back were on their feet and out the door in seconds. The other 2 gliders followed moments later, landing almost as perfectly. The German defenders were stunned. They had no warning. The silent approach of the gliders gave the British the element of surprise. Within 10 minutes, the battle for Pegasus Bridge was over. The bridges were captured intact. It was a textbook operation, a testament to what could be achieved with meticulous planning and extraordinary skill. Stephen Ambrose's book Pegasus Bridge provides a thrilling minute-by-minute account of the assault based on interviews with the men who were there. But even in this incredible success, there are lingering questions. What was the exact content of the final briefing given to the pilots, and did it include any contingency plans if they missed the landing zone? How did the German command structure fail so completely to anticipate an attack from the air on such a critical target? And if Jim Walwork's glider had been hit by a single lucky shot on its final approach, would the defense of the entire eastern flank of the D-Day invasion have collapsed? Number 12. What does a real landing zone look like? This is a wide aerial shot, taken the day after a major landing. The ground is littered with gliders. There must be hundreds of them. They are scattered across several fields, separated by hedgerows. Some seem to have landed perfectly. Others are in pieces, noses are smashed in, wings are torn off, tails are pointing to the sky. It looks like a giant's junkyard. This is what a landing zone looked like in Normandy or Holland. It is a scene of organized chaos. Planning a glider landing was an incredibly complex process. Planners used aerial reconnaissance photos to select landing zones, or LZs. They looked for fields that were large enough, flat enough, and free of major obstacles. But photos could be deceiving. A field that looked perfect from 10,000 feet could be soft and marshy or filled with ditches and posts that were invisible from the air. The Germans were well aware of the glider threat. In Normandy, they prepared for an invasion by flooding low-lying fields and erecting obstacles in likely LZs. These obstacles were thick wooden poles, often connected with wire and sometimes topped with mines. They were nicknamed Rommel's asparagus by the Allies. For a glider pilot coming in to land at night, hitting one of these poles was catastrophic. It could rip a wing off or tear the fuselage apart. The sheer number of gliders in an operation created its own dangers. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, thousands of gliders had to land in designated LZs in Holland over several days. The first wave of gliders would land and the fields would quickly become crowded with aircraft and equipment. The second wave would have to land in the same area, trying to find a clear spot while avoiding the wreckage of the first wave. It was a recipe for collisions and crashes. The aftermath of a landing was a scene of frantic activity. The troops had to get out, assemble their equipment, and move to their objectives as quickly as possible. The gliders were simply abandoned where they landed. They were not designed to be recovered or reused. They were disposable. In the days and weeks after a landing, engineering crews would come in and clear the wreckage, often by simply bulldozing the gliders into piles and setting them on fire. Local farmers would salvage the plywood and steel tubing to repair their homes and barns. This photograph of the cluttered LZ reveals the brutal calculus of glider operations. The High Command knew that a certain percentage of gliders would be destroyed on landing. They knew a certain percentage of men would be killed or injured before they even fired a shot. These losses were factored into the plan. It was an accepted cost of getting troops and heavy equipment onto the battlefield behind enemy lines. The official casualty figures for glider landings, found in documents like the Report of the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, often list landing accidents as a significant cause of losses, separate from combat action. But the photo also prompts some difficult questions. How were the LZs chosen when multiple intelligence sources gave conflicting information about ground conditions? Were pilots ever ordered to land in zones that senior commanders knew were dangerously prepared with obstacles? And what happened to the bodies of the men who died in the landings? How were they recovered from the hundreds of broken fuselages scattered across the landscape? At number 11, can you land a glider in a jungle? This is a strange photo. A Waco glider is sitting in a small, rough clearing. All around it is dense, triple canopy jungle. It seems impossible that an aircraft could have landed here. This image is from the Burma campaign, where gliders were used in a completely different and arguably even more challenging environment than Europe. The main use of gliders in Burma was to support the Chindits. These were special long-range penetration groups that operated deep behind enemy lines. Their mission was to disrupt communications and supply lines. They were supplied entirely by air. In March 1944, Operation Thursday was launched. It was a bold plan to fly a large Chindit force, including mules and engineering equipment, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines and establish fortified bases or strongholds in the jungle. The only way to get the first wave of troops and the heavy engineering equipment in was by glider. The problem was finding a place to land. The planners identified a few clearings in the dense jungle, giving them code names like Broadway, Piccadilly, and Chowringhee. But the reconnaissance photos were old. When the first wave of gliders approached Piccadilly, the pilots saw that the clearing had been obstructed with massive logs and ditches, making a landing impossible. A last-minute decision was made to divert the entire force to Broadway. The landings that night were an ordeal. The clearing was small and rough. The pilots had no lights to guide them. They were flying into a black hole in the middle of an endless jungle. Gliders crashed into each other and into the trees, ropes snapped, and gliders were lost in the darkness. The account of the operation in Louis Allen's book, Burma: The Longest War, describes the chaos and the courage of the pilots and soldiers. Despite heavy losses in men and equipment, enough of the force landed to secure the area. Once on the ground, the engineers worked frantically. They had been landed by glider with small bulldozers, also broken down and carried in gliders. They cleared the wreckage and carved a crude runway out of the jungle. Within 24 hours, the transport planes could start landing, bringing in the main body of the Chindit force. The operation was a success, but the cost was high. The gliders were the sacrificial first wave, the disposable tool used to open the door. The use of gliders in Burma showed their incredible versatility. They weren't just for European fields. They could be used to penetrate any kind of terrain as long as the pilots were skilled and brave enough. The image of that lone Waco in the jungle clearing is a testament to that. But it leaves us wondering, what level of detail was on the maps used by the pilots flying over a largely unmapped jungle at night? How did the men inside the gliders cope with the heat, humidity, and insects during the long tow? And was there ever a plan for what to do if all the designated clearings were found to be unusable? Number 10, how much did luck matter? Look at this picture. It's a miracle. The photographer was even there to take it. A Horsa glider has slammed into a stone farmhouse in Normandy. The cockpit is completely obliterated. The forward part of the fuselage is embedded in the stone wall. Yet, the wings and the tail section are remarkably intact. It's a perfect illustration of the thin line between life and death in a glider landing. The skill was essential for a glider pilot. Planning was critical. But in the end, so much of it came down to pure, dumb luck. A pilot could execute a perfect approach, only to have a stray shell hit the glider in the final seconds. Or they could hit an unseen ditch, causing the glider to flip over and crush everyone inside. Conversely, a pilot could make a terrible landing, smashing the glider to pieces, and yet everyone could walk away without a scratch. The landing was a violent event. The gliders came in fast, between 70 and 100 miles per hour. They had no brakes to speak of, just a small skid. The only way to stop was to crash into something. The ideal something was a gradual deceleration through soft earth or a hedgerow. The worst was an immovable object like a large tree, a stone wall, or another glider. The experience for the passengers was terrifying. They were seated on simple wooden benches along the sides of the fuselage. They were told to brace for impact, linking arms and pushing their feet hard against the floor or the seat in front of them. The sound of the landing was described by veterans as a deafening series of screeches, groans, and snaps as the wooden or fabric structure tore itself apart. The official U.S. Army Field Manual for glider troops, FM 70-15, had detailed diagrams on how to brace for a crash landing, an admission of the expected violence. This photo of the glider in the farmhouse represents a catastrophic landing. It's highly unlikely the pilots survived that impact. But what about the men in the back? The rear of the Horsa was a separate section bolted to the front. It was designed to be easily removed to unload cargo. It's possible that when the front of the glider hit the house, the tail section broke off, and the men in the back survived the crash. Or maybe the house was the only thing that stopped the glider from sliding into an even worse obstacle. We don't know. The photo captures a moment of extreme violence, but the outcome for the individuals involved is a mystery. It raises some fundamental questions about the nature of these operations. Like, how did the soldiers manage the fear, knowing that their survival depended so heavily on chance? Did pilots have good luck charms or rituals they performed before a mission? And when a crew survived a landing like the one in this photo, did they consider themselves skilled or just incredibly, unbelievably lucky? Number 9, what was the biggest glider operation of all? The photograph is an aerial view that is hard to comprehend. The sky is filled with planes and gliders. It's not a dozen or 50, it's hundreds upon hundreds. They stretch from one horizon to the other. Below them, the ground is scarred by smoke and explosions. This is Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the River Rhine on March 24th, 1945. It was the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Varsity was different from previous operations. In Normandy and Market Garden, the airborne troops had landed hours before the main ground forces, often in darkness. For the Rhine crossing, the plan was to land the airborne divisions after the ground troops had begun to cross the river in broad daylight. The idea was to land directly on top of the German artillery positions and rear echelon troops that were firing on the river crossing. It was a brutal direct approach. Over 1,500 gliders were used in the American and British sectors. They flew in massive streams, towed by an equally huge armada of C-47s, C-46s, Halifaxes, and Sterlings. Because they were flying in daylight and landing directly into defended areas, they faced intense opposition from the moment they crossed the river. The sky was thick with anti-aircraft fire. The scene on the ground was described by observers like historian James M. Gavin, who flew in the operation, as surreal. Our gliders were being hit in the air, catching fire and spiraling down. Tow ropes were snapping, gliders were landing in fields that were already being shelled. It was a concentrated dose of all the dangers of glider operations packed into a few chaotic hours. The landing zones were a confusing mess of burning wreckage, ongoing firefights, and men trying to assemble and find their units. Despite the heavy losses, the operation was a success. The gliders delivered thousands of troops and their heavy equipment exactly where they were needed. They quickly overran the German artillery positions, silencing the guns that were menacing the river crossing. The shock of the massive airborne assault broke the will of the local defenders. The link-up with the ground forces happened quickly. Our varsity proved that a massive daylight glider assault could work, but the price was steep. Casualty rates for the glider troops were high, some of the highest of any airborne operation. This photo of the sky filled with gliders captures the sheer scale of industrial warfare. Each one of those tiny shapes in the sky is a fragile container filled with men flying into a storm of steel. It was the peak of glider operations, a demonstration of the incredible logistical power the Allies could bring to bear. And yet, it makes one wonder, was the decision to land in broad daylight a necessary tactical choice or a reckless gamble? How many pilots and soldiers, seeing the ferocity of the anti-aircraft fire, knew they were flying on a suicide mission? And given the success of the operation, why was Operation Varsity effectively the last great combat glider assault in history? Number 8, what was it like for the men in the back? This is an interior shot of a Horsa glider taken before takeoff. Men of an airborne unit are packed onto simple wooden benches. They are weighed down with equipment, rifles, packs, ammunition, grenades. Their faces are a mixture of emotions. Some are trying to sleep, some are staring blankly, one or two are forcing a smile for the camera. The space is tight. It's dark, and you can almost feel the nervous energy. For the regular infantryman, the glider ride was a unique and often terrifying experience. They had little to no training for it. They were simply loaded on, told to hold on tight, and hope for the best. They had no control over their fate. They were entirely in the hands of the two pilots at the front, men they had probably just met. The flight itself was an ordeal. The snatch takeoff was a violent jolt. The long tow was often turbulent, causing air sickness. The noise from the wind rushing past the thin fuselage was constant. But the worst part was the silence. When the tow rope was released, the only sound was the whistling of the wind. That silence meant they were going down, and the next few minutes would determine if they lived or died. Inside, the men were a captive audience to the landing. They could see out the small windows as the ground rushed up to meet them. They could hear the pilot shouting commands or warnings. They braced themselves as they heard the sickening sound of the glider's belly scraping along the ground, then the crash as it hit a tree or a ditch. In his book, Band of Brothers, Stephen Ambrose recounts the experiences of men from the 101st Airborne Division. Many veterans told him that the glider ride into Normandy or Holland was the single most terrifying experience of their entire war. More frightening than a firefight, because in a firefight, they could do something. In the glider, they were helpless. Once the glider came to a stop, chaos erupted. If they were lucky, the doors would still work. If not, they had to use axes or their bayonets to cut their way out through the canvas or plywood skin. They had to get out fast because the wrecked glider was a perfect target for enemy mortar and machine gun fire. They had to find their equipment, form up into their units, and get to their objective, all while disoriented and shaken from the landing. This photo of the men's faces tells a story of quiet endurance. They're not pilots or elite commandos. They are ordinary soldiers about to be delivered to their workplace by the most dangerous means imaginable. But what did they talk about during the long flight to ease the tension? Were there official procedures for how to evacuate a crashed and burning glider, or were the men left to their own devices? And how many acts of bravery happened inside the fuselage, with men helping their injured comrades out of the wreckage that were never witnessed or recorded? Number 7, how did they get a Jeep inside a glider? The photo shows the solution to a difficult problem. The nose of a Waco CG-4A glider is hinged and swung straight up, revealing the entire front of the aircraft to be open. 2 soldiers are guiding a Jeep down a small set of ramps from the cockpit area. The fit is incredibly tight. There are only inches of clearance on either side. Getting heavy equipment to the battlefield was the primary reason for the existence of large combat gliders. Parachutes could deliver men and small containers, but they couldn't deliver a Jeep, a howitzer, or a bulldozer. The glider was the only answer. The American Waco was designed with this in mind from the start. The entire cockpit section, including the pilot's seats and controls, could be swung upwards to create a large opening. Loading a Jeep was a precise operation. It had to be driven up ramps and carefully positioned inside. The weight had to be perfectly balanced to ensure the glider was stable in flight. The vehicle was then chained down to rings on the plywood floor. Sometimes, to save weight, the Jeep's windshield would be folded down and its gas tank would be only partially filled. The crew of the Jeep, or the gun crew for an artillery piece, would ride in the back of the glider. Unloading was even more critical. It had to be done under pressure, often while being shot at. Once the glider landed, the pilots would release the latches holding the nose in place. The nose would swing up and the ground crew would quickly unchain the vehicle. Ramps were attached and the Jeep could be driven out, ready for action within minutes of landing. This capability gave airborne troops immediate mobility and firepower, something they desperately needed in the first crucial hours of an operation. The British Horsa had a different solution. It could be loaded from the side, but its main feature was a detachable tail section. After landing, the bolts holding the tail on could be explosively released or manually removed, and the entire rear of the aircraft would come off, allowing vehicles and guns to be rolled out the back. Both the Waco's hinged nose and the Horsa's detachable tail were clever, practical solutions to the challenge of rapidly unloading cargo in a combat zone. These features are well documented in technical manuals of the era, such as the pilot's flight operating instructions for the CG-4A. This image of the Jeep emerging from the glider is a perfect example of form-following function. The glider looks strange, almost broken, with its nose in the air, but that strange design was what made it so effective. Still, some practical questions are hard to answer from the manuals. What happened if the nose lifting mechanism on a Waco was damaged in the landing, trapping the Jeep inside? How often did a Jeep or gun break its chains during a turbulent flight or a hard landing, and with what consequences for the aircraft's stability? And who had the unenviable job of being the first man out of the glider to face whatever was waiting for them outside? Number 6, were they all wrecks? This is a beautiful, almost peaceful photograph. A Waco glider is sitting perfectly intact in a wide green field. It looks like it could take off again. There are no other gliders around, no wreckage, just the single silent aircraft. It's a reminder that not every glider landing ended in a tangle of splintered wood and torn fabric. Sometimes everything went right. A successful glider landing was a thing of beauty. The pilot would manage the descent perfectly, bleed off speed over the field, and touch down with a gentle whoosh. The glider would skid to a stop in 100 yards or so, straight and level. The doors would open, and the troops would get out, assembled, and ready to go. For the men on board, a landing like this was an enormous relief, a quiet anticlimax after hours of tension. These perfect landings were more common than the dramatic crash photos might suggest. During Operation Market Garden, many of the landing zones near Arnhem and Nijmegen were large, flat, and initially undefended. The first waves of gliders landed with remarkable success. Pilots were able to pick their spots, land, and get out of the way for the next aircraft. The memoirs of glider pilots like Mike Dauncey, who flew a Horsa into Arnhem, described the landings as almost routine, at least in the initial stages of the operation. The success of a landing depended on a huge number of variables. The quality of the landing zone was paramount. The time of day was also a factor. Daylight landings were inherently less chaotic than night landings. The level of enemy opposition was another. A pilot who could focus solely on flying without having to worry about anti-aircraft fire had a much better chance of putting the glider down safely. This photo of the lone, perfect glider asks us to remember the successes as well as the failures. It represents the skill of the pilots and the moments when the complex, dangerous system worked exactly as it was designed to. For every 10 photos of wreckage, there might be one like this. It's the exception that proves the rule, but it's an important exception. It shows that the concept was sound, even if the execution was often flawed and costly. But it also raises some questions. What percentage of gliders in a major operation actually landed intact like this one? Were pilots who consistently made good landings studied by their superiors to see what they were doing differently? And for the soldiers who experienced a smooth landing, did it give them a false sense of security about the dangers that lay just a few hundred yards outside their quiet field? Number 5, what happened to the pilots after landing? Here is a photograph of 2 men in American uniforms. They are holding rifles and look dirty and tired. They could be any infantrymen except for the wings on their chests. They are glider pilots. They have done their flying job. Now, their job is to fight. This image captures the unique dual role of these men. The official doctrine was clear: a glider pilot was a soldier first. After landing the glider, his responsibility was to join the airborne troops he had delivered and fight as part of their unit. They were trained in the use of infantry weapons like the M1 rifle, the carbine, and the submachine gun. They were organized into their own platoons and companies and were expected to defend the landing zone or participate in offensive actions. This policy had mixed results. On the one hand, it provided extra manpower at a critical moment in chaotic situations like the landings in Normandy, where airborne units were scattered all over the countryside. Every extra rifle counted. The pilots were highly motivated and often found themselves fighting alongside high-ranking officers who had also arrived by glider. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, landed by glider in Normandy, as did General James Gavin of the 82nd. On the other hand, the pilots were a valuable and highly trained asset. Every pilot lost in ground combat was one less pilot available for future operations. They were difficult and expensive to replace. After the Normandy invasion, there was a major effort to round up the surviving glider pilots and get them back to England. This proved to be a difficult task. Many were killed or wounded. Others were simply absorbed into infantry units and fought for days or weeks before they could be located and evacuated. In his extensive history of the U.S. Airborne Forces, Ridgway's paratroopers Clay Blair documents the debate among senior commanders about this very issue. Was it better to use the pilots as infantry or to protect them as a valuable resource? After the heavy losses in pilots during Operation Market Garden, the policy began to shift. In Operation Varsity, more emphasis was placed on quickly recovering the pilots from the battle zone. The photo of these 2 armed pilots represents this strange paradox. They are aviators who have completed their flight. Now they are ground pounders waiting for the next firefight. Their journey was over, but their battle had just begun. And this leaves us with some unresolved issues. How effective were the pilots as infantrymen compared to the troops who had been training for that role full time? Were there instances of glider pilots taking command of infantry squads when the original leaders were killed or wounded? And what was the process for a pilot to transition back to flying after weeks of brutal ground combat? Number 4, were gliders ever recovered? This photo shows a C-47 transport plane flying very low over a field. Trailing behind it is a long cable with a hook. On the ground, a Waco glider sits between 2 tall poles. A rope stretches from the glider's nose and is looped over the top of the poles. The plane is about to fly into the loop and snatch the glider off the ground and back into the air. This was the only way to retrieve a glider from a field. Most combat gliders were considered disposable. They were abandoned after landing. But in training areas or on secure airfields behind the lines, it was necessary to retrieve them for reuse. The ground-based snatch takeoff was too rough and required a long runway. So the aerial snatch system was developed. It was a wild and dangerous procedure. The system was based on the old airmail pickup technique used to grab mail bags from small towns without landing. For a glider, the scale was just much bigger. After the glider was emptied, a special retrieval crew would set up the system. They would erect two poles about 12 feet high and string the glider's tow rope between them. The C-47 tow plane would fly in at about 120 miles per hour, trailing a hook on a long arm. The pilot had to aim perfectly to snag the rope. When the hook caught, the energy transfer was immense. A complex winch system inside the C-47 with a large drum of cable and a powerful brake would spool out to absorb the initial shock. This prevented the rope from snapping and the glider from being torn apart. The glider would lurch forward and be airborne in a few seconds, climbing steeply behind the tow plane. It was a rough ride for anyone inside. This technique was used extensively in the Burma campaign to retrieve gliders from the jungle clearings that had been secured. It was also used to recover gliders from training fields in the US and UK. However, it was almost never used to recover gliders from a combat landing zone in Europe. The risk of trying to land a retrieval crew and set up the equipment under enemy fire was just too great. It was easier and cheaper to just build a new glider. The photo of the aerial snatch is a picture of raw power and surprising ingenuity. It's a brute force solution to a complex problem. It looks like something out of a circus act, but it was a functional, if risky, military procedure. The engineering behind the winch and braking system was sophisticated, a topic detailed in technical reports from the Army Air Force's Material Command. But questions about this strange procedure remain. How many retrieval attempts failed, resulting in the destruction of the tow plane, the glider, or both? Who were the men on the ground crews who had to set up this system, and what were their casualty rates? And was there ever a case of a wounded soldier being evacuated from a battlefield by being snatched out in a glider? Number 3, why did the glider program disappear? This image is from the late 1940s. A vast airfield is packed with thousands of Waco gliders. They are lined up in neat rows stretching off into the distance. But they are not being prepared for a mission. They are being scrapped. Men are stripping the canvas off their frames. This is the end of the line for the American glider program. Within a few years of the war's end, the combat glider was obsolete. So why did this weapon, which had been built in such huge numbers and used in every major invasion, disappear so quickly? There were several reasons. The first was the high cost in human lives. Glider operations were incredibly dangerous. The casualty rates from landing accidents alone were often unacceptably high. Military planners knew there had to be a better way. The second reason was the rapid improvement in technology. By the end of the war, transport aircraft were becoming more powerful. Planes like the C-82 Packet and the later C-119 flying boxcar were designed with rear-loading ramps. They could land on short, rough airstrips and deliver vehicles and heavy equipment directly. They could also take off again. They did everything a glider could do, but better and more safely. The third, and perhaps most important, reason was the helicopter. The helicopter was still in its infancy during the war, but its potential was obvious. It could land vertically in a tiny clearing, deliver troops and supplies with pinpoint accuracy, and evacuate the wounded. It offered a level of precision and flexibility that the glider could never match. As helicopter technology improved rapidly in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the military saw that it was the future of airborne assault. The glider was a dead end. So the vast fleet of gliders was declared surplus. The contracts were canceled. The training programs were shut down. The thousands of gliders stored in depots across the country, like the ones in this photograph, were sold for scrap. The wood and canvas were burned. The steel tubing was melted down. A few were bought by civilians for curiosity's sake, but the vast majority were simply destroyed. The era of the combat glider, which had begun so dramatically at Eben and Mile only a few years before, was over. The image of these gliders being dismantled is a somber one. It represents the unsentimental nature of military progress. A weapon that thousands of men had relied on and died in was now just junk. Its purpose served. This rapid decline raises some final important questions. Did any military planners argue for keeping the glider program, perhaps for specialized stealth missions? where the silence of the glider would still be an advantage? What happened to the thousands of highly skilled glider pilots? Were their skills transferable to other forms of aviation, or did they simply return to civilian life? And how much of the knowledge and doctrine developed at such a great cost during the war was simply lost when the program was abandoned? Number two, could this technology ever come back? Here is our penultimate photograph. It's a modern image in color. It shows a sleek, futuristic-looking unmanned aircraft. It has long, slender wings like a sailplane. It has no engine. It's a drone glider. It is being developed for reconnaissance or for delivering small, specialized payloads. The design principles are hauntingly familiar. The idea of a silent, unpowered aircraft delivering something behind enemy lines did not die with the Waco and the Horsa. The core advantages of the glider are still relevant. It has a very low heat signature, making it difficult to detect with infrared sensors. It is acoustically silent, making it hard to hear, and it is cheap and disposable. These are all attractive qualities for modern military applications. Today, the concept is being reborn in the world of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. There's ongoing research documented in journals like the Journal of Aircraft into high-altitude glider drones that can be released from a mothership and then soar for hundreds of miles, gathering intelligence or deploying sensors. They use advanced materials like carbon fiber instead of plywood and canvas. They use GPS and autonomous flight control systems instead of a pilot with a map and a yaw string. The mission is different. They are not designed to carry a platoon of soldiers or a jeep. They are designed to carry data or small, high-tech packages. But the fundamental principle is the same: use a powered aircraft to get the glider to altitude and then release it for a long, silent, unpowered glide to a target. It's the ghost of the combat glider resurrected with 21st century technology. This image of the modern drone glider forces us to look at the wartime photos in a new light. We see the Waco and the Horsa not just as historical artifacts, but as the primitive ancestors of a new generation of military hardware. The tactical problems that the glider was invented to solve, the need for stealth, surprise, and the delivery of assets into denied areas have not gone away. And this leads to some thought-provoking questions about the future. Could a large unmanned glider, a modern-day Hamilcar, be used to deliver a robotic tank or a heavy supply payload to a remote battlefield? Is it possible that the development of advanced artificial intelligence could one day create an autonomous glider pilot capable of making the complex decisions needed to land in a rough, unprepared zone? And are we potentially on the verge of a new era of glider warfare, one fought not with brave men, but with silent, disposable machines? Number one, what does a single face tell us? The last photograph is a simple portrait. It is a close-up of an elderly man's face. He is wearing a veteran's cap. On the cap is a small silver pin of a glider. His eyes are looking somewhere off camera. His face is a map of wrinkles. It is a face that has seen things. You know, this is a former glider pilot decades after the war. In the end, after all the discussion of technology, strategy, and machinery, the story of the combat gliders comes down to the people. It comes down to the individual human beings who designed them, built them, flew them, and rode in them. This man's face contains the whole story. The mixture of pride, loss, and memory is visible in his expression. He is one of the survivors. He is one of the men who sat in the cramped cockpit, wrestling with the controls of an overloaded aircraft with no engine. He is one of the men who experienced the silent descent, the violent landing, and the sudden transition to ground combat. He saw his friends succeed, and he saw them fail. He lived through moments of sheer terror and moments of incredible courage. He was part of a unique brotherhood, a small group of men who did one of the war's most dangerous jobs. When the war ended, these men went home. They took off their uniforms and went back to their lives. They became farmers, salesmen, teachers, and engineers. The glider program was dismantled. The great airfields fell silent. For many years, their story was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the more glamorous tales of fighter pilots and bomber crews. There are very few memorials dedicated specifically to the glider pilots and the glider-born troops. Their contribution is often just a footnote in the larger histories of the great battles, but the men themselves did not forget. They held reunions, they told their stories to their families and to historians. They preserved the memory of what they had done. Organizations like the National World War II Glider Pilots Association in the United States worked for decades to ensure their legacy was not lost. This final photograph of this single veteran is the most powerful of all. It is a direct link to the past. It reminds us that behind all the black and white photos of wreckage and machinery, there were living, breathing people. And young men who volunteered for a job that required an extraordinary amount of skill and a phenomenal amount of courage. And as we look at his face, we are left with the most fundamental questions of all. What did he see in those final seconds before landing in Normandy or Holland or Burma? What memories does he carry that were never written down in any official report? And when we look at the photos of those jaw-dropping landings, are we truly capable of understanding what it felt like to be there?